Hello, my name is Lee Presser. This is my show. I speak frequently to very interesting people. Some of these conversations are so exciting, so intellectually stimulating, I thought others might like to listen in. This is the reason we started recording Conversation with Lee Presser.
Welcome to Conversation with Lee Presser. In the summer of 2007, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers announced that there were design deficiencies in the levees which protect Madison, St. Clair, and Monroe counties in Illinois. The Corps worried that those deficiencies could prevent it from certifying that the levees can protect those counties against a large Mississippi River flood. FEMA, based on the Corps' findings, announced a decision to de-accredit the Metro East levee systems. The reclassification of these counties as a special flood hazard area would have had a dramatic and chilling impact on economic growth. Citizens reacted by creating a special sales tax. This sales tax has created a revenue stream which has allowed the repair and modernization of 84 miles of levees, which protects Metro East. Our guest today, Chuck Etwert, with his 40 years of engineering experience working with governmental agencies, including Metropolitan St. Sewer District. He took the helm from the retiring Chief Supervisor Les Sterman on January 15, 2014. Mr. Etwert is here to bring citizens up to date about the reconstruction of the levee system that protects their homes and businesses. Chuck Etwert, welcome to Conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So let's just cut right to it. I mean, where do we stand right now? And if you want to start with some background and then move forward, that's fine.
Well, where we stand right now is we are making progress. We have 9 construction projects, 2 have been completed. They total about $72 million in construction value, and we've completed about $50 million. We have had some setbacks with high rivers during the last year. We had high rivers in June, and of course just recently around Christmas and New Year's. And of course anytime we have high rivers, that delays the construction. Corps of Engineers requires that when the river comes up at certain levels, we cannot dig into the ground. And unfortunately the river comes up very quickly but goes down very slowly. And anytime we have that happen, the construction gets delayed. Mm-hmm. We do hope to have all the projects completed by September of this year.
September 2016.
September 2016. We have to, or we hope to have all our paperwork submitted to FEMA by, we'll say, January of 2017, and we hope to have that accreditation achieved by late spring or early summer of 2017.
What is the accreditation going to say?
Well, the accreditation will say that the area is protected from a 100-year flood. That's a flood that has the chance of occurring 1% any year, on average, once every 100 years. Doesn't mean you couldn't have 2 or 3 within a 10 or 15-year period, but on average you will have a 100-year flood once every 100 years.
Or you could have a 100-year flood in a 3-year period like we did in 93 and then again in 95.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Now, you mentioned this rain that occurred in December of 2015, which is just a few months ago. By the way, we're taping this so that if people want to know, we're taping this. This is March the 22nd, 2016, right now.
Correct.
So this event that you're talking about occurred in 2015, December.
Yes.
Christmas time. As a matter of fact, we had Lance Lacombe from MSD here talking about how he was away
sure, I bet he
on his honeymoon.
Oh, wow.
And all of a sudden got the call that some of his infrastructure was being overrun by rain. Mm-hmm. So what actually, here, this is a perfect example. Let's talk about, we had this, what was it, 10 inches of rain in a short period of time, maybe 13 inches of rain?
It was a lot. We were fortunate.
Okay, so what does that mean for the Mississippi River? What is it that your system is supposed to do in a situation like that?
Well, our system is to prevent flooding of the area behind the levee. And everything that we're doing is to prevent seepage or to take care of any seepage that goes through the levee or underneath the levee. Our levees are high enough, built high enough. Normally when you tell people that you work for the levee district and we're improving the levees, the first thing they think is, oh, you're raising the levee higher. In our case, we're not. Our levees are built sufficient enough for the 100-year and also the 500-year, which is the Corps of Engineers standard. The 100-year is the FEMA standard, and that's where they determine whether you need flood insurance or not. So our levees are built high enough, but what we're doing is corrections to the levees to improve the levees to prevent that underground seepage. When you have seepage going through the levee, you can end up with sand boils occurring, which can deteriorate the levee itself.
Explain to people what you mean by the term sand boil.
Well, a sand boil is just an area in the ground where water starts to come up, and it's just
so it's on the other side.
It's on the land side, and you know it can occur very small, and then they just get bigger and bigger. And as they get bigger, they get closer, of course, to the toe of the levee, and then they can damage the levee itself, and that's what you have to protect against. And
so a little tunnel of water came from the riverside underneath the big slabs of concrete that is the levee, came underneath and then came up on the land side, and you're saying that once it comes up there, then it'll start to spread and basically just tear out the land until it reaches the levee itself.
So when that happens, you want to sandbag around that boil, that round area, smaller area of water, and then either pump it out or control it so it doesn't spread further.
So what do you do with the hole that has now...
Well, you'll have to go back and repair that after the flood goes down.
So this, what you're talking about, these sand boils, this is during times of high water?
Yes.
Is this only during times of high water?
Yes.
So you're like right now, is the Mississippi considered at normal stage now, or is it still?
It might still be a little bit above normal, but it's not hindering any of our construction at this point. Okay. It's down far enough that our contractors can get in there and work.
So this boil system, or this, what do you call it, sand boil?
Sand boil.
Sand boil. This is not happening normally.
Correct.
Okay. And the only time it's going to happen is when the river goes up, when we've had significant amounts of rain either here or north of here, and then water starts coming down south towards us.
When that river comes up, that just puts more water pressure on the levee and forcing that water underground.
Was that part of the issue that the Corps was discussing back in what was it, 07?
Yeah. In
2000. This is after Katrina, right?
Correct.
Hurricane Katrina, which occurred in New Orleans, that devastated that town. That was a trigger for the Corps of Engineers to start looking at levee systems across the United States.
Correct. They started to look at everything much more closer, and they came to the determination that without flood fighting, without taking care of those sand boils and everything, they couldn't really certify that our levee was protected at the 100-year level. Even though our levees, all the levees that we're talking about the 84 miles of levee, as you indicated earlier, from Alton down to Columbia, they had withstood the 1993 flood. But there was some flood fighting involved at that time. So the Corps felt that, they were concerned after Katrina that they didn't want to do a certification if you still needed some flood fighting. So that started everything into action. When they said that, FEMA said, well, if you don't think that the levee will operate without flood fighting, then we're not sure we can certify it. We're going to have to decertify it. And that really started the wheels in the action of the three counties basically getting together, which is very unique throughout the country. They have three separate governmental bodies coming together, generating revenues to tackle a problem and taking care of it on their own. And that's what's happened here in southwestern Illinois.
What would it have meant to any of those three counties, had FEMA done a decertify of the levee?
Well, if the levee had been decertified, flood insurance rates would have gone up. It was estimated that the flood insurance rates would increase by $50 million annually for residential and businesses located in the area. They thought residential rates might go 5 or 6 times what they were at the time. So someone who maybe was paying $200 a year might be paying $1,200 or $1,500 a year. Businesses would have to pay increased amounts also. Also, if you're in a decertified area, it's not really a desirable area for people to build in. For development to occur, people would say, well, why would I want to build there if there's a risk of flooding? There also would have been changes in the building code. Any new buildings would have to be built higher because to be above the flood elevation. So there were a lot of drastic effects if the area was decertified.
Was this a realistic problem or was this just the Corps of Engineer and FEMA overreacting to the events of New Orleans?
Well,
from an engineer's point of view.
Excuse me. I think that, they were protecting themselves. Is it an overreaction? I can't say for sure. I mean, I can only go back to say all the levees that we had survived a 93 flood. It was estimated to be, I think, a 300-year flood. So the Corps was just really trying, I think, to protect themselves. They didn't really want another Katrina.
And so then how much money, you mentioned some money early on, but from day one to the end, at the end of this year or whenever it is that you will actually have completed the project, how much money will you have spent on this project?
Well, I think we'll probably, by the time of completion, about 110 million.
110. Of course, I was looking back at my notes, and in the early days, they were talking about $500 million for this project, but then I guess cooler heads and better engineers figured out that they didn't need to spend that kind of money.
Originally, the estimate was a lot higher. I don't know exactly what the number was. I wasn't here at that time, but the Corps said that it would probably take until 2044 based on the funding that they had anticipated before the project could be completed. The three counties felt they couldn't wait till 2044, so they really set an interim goal to achieve the 100-year flood protection and a long-range goal to get the 500-year flood protection. They did levy tax, a sales tax, in all three counties.
Now, people voted on that, right?
Each of the councils, I believe, are the ones that passed the tax. I don't think there was a county-wide tax by the people voting, but all the elected officials did pass the tax.
Okay. And that's a small sales tax?
It's a small quarter-cent sales tax. It generates about $11.5 million a year.
And that's used for bonds, right? That's not. They're not depending on that $11 million in order to pay for stuff. That's to back bonds.
It's basically the back bonds. Monroe contributes about 5% of the tax, and Madison and St. Clair about 47.5% each for that $11.5 million. With that $11.5 million, we were able to issue about $94 million worth of bonds in, I think, 2010. And we just recently issued another $77 million in bonds that we're going to use towards that 500-year level just this past December.
And pay off by approximately?
25 years. They're 25 years bonds. The district council will be in existence until all the bonds are paid off. And basically, we are at our max right now. With the bonds we issued previously and just recently, we really won't have the capability based on the revenues from the sales tax to issue any more bonds. But we feel that we can get a good majority of the 500-year improvements done with these additional bonds that we did issue.
Now, you've mentioned the 500-year a couple of times, and I want to get to that in just a moment.
Sure.
But I want to just clear one other thing up for those who are listening in. You mentioned, and I mentioned, 84 miles. Everybody knows that it's not 84 miles from Alton to Columbia.
Correct.
So explain, where does this 84 mile come in?
Well, when you talk about flood protection, you're just not talking along the Mississippi. You're talking about all the tributaries that come in. So when you're building a levee, that levee just isn't along the Mississippi. It goes up every tributary that flows into the Mississippi. So when you add that all up, that's where you get your 84 miles.
Okay, so now we've cleared that up too, because people are going like, 84 miles, oh, what are they talking about? So, all right, now, you say by the end of this year, September sometime, you anticipate the 100-year, in other words, the 1% chance flood each year. That you will meet those standards. You're not going to have these sand boils, and all the concrete slabs will stand, so in other words, well, actually I was going to say a 93 type flood, but you said that was a 300-year flood, which was much higher than a 100-year. What is the height of a 100-year flood?
It varies along the river. There's not really an exact height. I think the 100-year flood, as far as the St. Louis gauge per the Corps of Engineers, I think is 52 feet. And the levee is built to 54 plus feet.
On this side, what about on the Missouri side? Is that the same?
I believe it's the same.
Okay. Because I know that in '93 I was there, and the water came. Anybody who knows the arch grounds, you know that when you went down a bunch of steps towards the river, but that river had come up to within a couple of steps of the top. Very, very lucky that, because I can't imagine what would have happened to downtown St. Louis had that water topped over and come into all the infrastructure down there.
Absolutely.
In the basements of all those big buildings and down in all the culverts and everywhere else. So now you're going from that to a 500 year.
Yes.
And so now explain what it is that project is going to look like.
Well, with the 500 year, there could be some what they call additional deep cutoff walls, where you build a slurry of a bentonite cement and you dig down maybe 140 feet to prevent that seepage from occurring. Again, 500.
So it's all under, not higher.
The levees are high enough for the 500 year. We may put some more clay caps or seepage berms, just making the levees wider with earth material, approved earth material, not just any earth.
Yes.
Anything to prevent that seepage, because as the water goes higher with the 500 year, again, more pressure on the levee. And so
the pressure is downward.
Downward and against the levee. And so you might have to build a deep cutoff wall. You might have to put in additional clay caps to keep the water from flowing through, like on the riverside, or put more seepage berms and more relief wells, because you're always going to get some water going underneath. You just have to be able to handle it. So if you build some relief wells to collect that, then you'll just pump it back over the levee.
And how, you know, people are like, oh, well, seepage, why? I mean, you're spending all this money, but you're saying that this is normal and natural from an engineering point of view.
Yes.
So you just have to...
And needed, required, you know, for the protection. To protect the area behind the levee, there's certain things you have to do.
So then you're going to take and then shoot it back over the wall and back into the river.
Right.
All right.
There's numerous pump stations located on the land side that's what they do. They pump the flow that either comes to the pump stations from the land side or that comes underneath. They pump it back over.
Now, I'm trying to remember the name. In '93, you remember where there's now a huge shopping complex in St. Louis.
Oh, Chesterfield Valley?
Yes, Chesterfield Valley. Was it the Monarch? That
Monarch
failed?
is part of that along there.
But isn't that where it failed?
I believe so.
One Saturday morning, I believe it was. And it was the most amazing television that I'd seen, where all of a sudden this whole area filled up. Of course, now they've built this huge shopping complex in there. So what is to prevent something like that from happening on the... why did that happen from an engineering point of view? And secondly, what's to prevent that from happening again, either on that side or on the Illinois side?
Well, obviously the levee wasn't either high enough or strong enough, and there was a breach in the levee, and that caused that whole area to flood. Since that time, that area has improved their levees, and from what I understand, I think those levees have been improved to the 500-year level.
I hope.
So, yeah. So, I mean, they are protected up to that point. There's nothing to say that you couldn't get a greater than 500-year flood, but they improved the levees, and they have the development there now.
Okay. So, yeah, I'd heard, and I'm not an engineer, but I heard that the failure of Monarch actually saved downtown.
It probably helped. The
water went,
some of the water went somewhere.
Yes, and that was, and of course, on the Illinois side, you had, what was it, the city of Valmeyer that was literally wiped away. They just rebuilt it on the top of that hillside.
Correct, and that probably helped too, reduce flooding in other areas because that levee broke.
Now let's just back up a little bit. There are those who say that levees can't work in the long run. That the river, the water will always win out over the long run, and that human beings have spent foolishly, in their opinion, foolishly all this time and money and energy to try to make walls, which just makes the river and the water go up higher and higher, where it normally used to spread out over this vast area, right?
Correct.
Isn't that the way it used to be?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But unfortunately, people decided to actually build houses and use the property, and so that was the reason why folks started with the levees in order
Correct. And we're at a point here, though, where the levees were built. We have a tremendous amount of development behind the levees here in southwestern Illinois. Fortunately here, again, we're not raising our levees. So we're not really going to be forcing more water anywhere else than what's there now. What we're doing is to protect those levees, but it's not like our levees are too low and we're adding 4 or 5 feet higher height to them that could possibly shift water somewhere else. So in our case, we're doing everything we can to protect the homeowners and the businesses behind the levees by improving those levees, but we are not increasing their height.
Yeah, because people downriver have been heard to complain that,
Sure.
that as walls go up higher and higher, the water, that's why they get flooded. That if the water were allowed to expand more north, that they wouldn't get it so bad down south.
Correct.
As an engineer, and not speaking for the levee district here, do you think that perhaps we ought to be looking at the idea of letting the water go where it needs to go rather than leveeing it up?
Well, I think some areas are looking at that as a result of all the construction that has occurred in the past years. I think people take a lot closer look nowadays than they used to as far as should we build a new levee here? Yeah.
I mean, do you guys in the engineering, I'm sure that you have your own magazines and, and papers that you shift back and forth between you. Is that been much of a discussion?
There has been some. I can't really say if that's any more discussion on that issue than other issues nowadays. It's hard to control nature and the floods, and we have no control over it. I think that was just experienced in St. Louis County with the Merrimack River. 4 foot above the highest flood of record, that's what they experienced in December. I don't think anyone, they did improvements, and fortunately they did improvements in the Valley Park area, and that levee held, but that water was a lot higher than ever.
That was pretty shocking. There was one area where there's a railroad bridge that's visible off of Missouri 141 in Valley Park, and several years ago, I can't remember what year, 11 maybe, when the water was way up. It never even came close to that railroad bridge, and this time it topped it.
Right. I mean, we were fortunate. The Mississippi really wasn't that high in December. And not as the Merrimack, because it was much more localized flooding there, and it's horrible when you have that flood. I mean, look at the transportation issues that occurred with people not being able to get into Jefferson County because all the access routes were closed. And,
and there's always that little issue of 141 and 44, because 44 goes under, 141 goes under 44 instead of over it.
Right.
And as an engineer, can you explain what is it, and I know this is way out of the main area, but can you explain why does that area fill up with water when there's high water on the Merrimack?
Well, it just shows you how the high water of the Merrimack affects so many areas, and the water just comes up through all the different drainage pipes, and that is a low area.
So it's just backflowing.
It's really backflowing, yes.
And there are valves to check that, but I guess that
there's not enough valves to check that type of flow.
Okay. So coming back to here, we're down to the last 4 or 5 minutes.
Sure.
Have we? Is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like people to know?
Well, I think I'd like people just to know that we are making progress. We are going to get the projects done. and we're going to have more money to spend towards that 500-year level. I mean, originally, I don't think people thought or weren't sure, is there enough money even to build the 100-year? We're going to get the 100-year done, and I think if the Corps can get some funding, I think there's a possibility that we could get to that 500-year level maybe as soon as 2024 or 2025. We're going to have, with the money that we've issued now with these last bonds that we've gotten, we're going to have all the local share that basically is needed. It's going to be really.
So you're waiting for the federal government.
We're going to be waiting
Good
for
luck on that
We're
one.
going to be waiting for the federal government. But if the federal government can get funding, I think we can get these projects built maybe 20 years sooner than what people thought 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And that means, therefore, that the people who live in the valley areas, in particular, that's what.
Right.
Where if water were to come in, not
Right.
not the people who live up on the bluffs.
Right. It's
But
all
the
the
people
lower area.
from the bluffs on to the river, that whole area. The people, because of the work that your organization has done, will not have insurance rates, flood insurance rates that are 3, 4, 5 times greater than they're paying now.
Correct. And I think it'll be, I think people will want to possibly develop in the area now, knowing more, there'll be more development, knowing that the area is protected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was, well, we have the over, was it Shell or whoever, I don't even know who owns it anymore, over in the Roxana, South Roxana area, where they have huge refineries which supply gasoline to this entire region of the United States, that if they got flooded would knock out gasoline production. Right. And send prices through the roof of gasoline as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, we have a wide, diverse area. I mean, we have farming on the south, we have residential, populated area in the middle, and then we have a lot of warehousing to the north. So I mean, it's a wide, diverse area that we're protecting.
Mm-hmm. Yes, people, I guess they really didn't realize when they decided to build all this that they were going to someday need to think about protecting it even more.
Well, you know, if you go back in time, people developed and lived along rivers and streams. That's where development occurred. And then as more and more development occurred, they realized they needed to protect themselves, and that's how the levees began.
And, you know, let's face it, in the 100 years ago, 200 years ago, they got washed away, but then they came back. But they didn't expect the government or their neighbors to come along and spend the money in order to make them whole again. And that's the difference today, isn't it? That,
yes, it is.
That there is a lot of social requirements, federal money put in, local money put in order to protect all these interests.
Mm-hmm. And actually, the levees we're improving were really built by the federal government back in the 30s and 40s, and they were maintained properly. And so now, you know, we're fixing them up.
And that's a good thing too.
Yes, it is.
Thank you very much for being with us today. And I've been speaking with Chuck Etwert. He's with the Southwestern Illinois
Flood Prevention District
Council. Thank you. And we're going to be uploading this to YouTube so that you can show your friends what you learned here today. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.